Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Sorry, I need to. Welcome to. I'm getting feedback on this. Here, good. And any declarations of a pecuniary interest? There being none. I'd like to introduce our guests from Clarion, in fact. I think that would be courteous. So let me welcome Michelle Reynolds, COO, Richard Cook, hello Richard, and Nick Hood, thank you. And I'm looking also for James Kinnersly. James, welcome, good. And I'm going to, perhaps members of the panel could introduce themselves. Nick McLean, go on Nick, yep. And Thomas Barlow here, so.
Councillor Thomas Barlow, evening.
Cool.
It's Councillor Ed Mundy, Chair of Sustainable Communities. Know each other very well.
Ben?
Hi, I'm Ben Butler.
Sally Kenny.
Billy Christie.
Okay, thank you all. And our cabinet member is Martin Welton is here. Martin, welcome. And my vice chair, how could I forget him?
And last but not least, Councillor Peter McCabe. I represent Ravensbury Ward.
And John. You hid away at the back there, John, but welcome anyway. Good. Okay. So the purpose of a call-in is not to take a second look at a decision made by Cabinet. I mean, Cabinet are in the unenviable position of sometimes having to take unpopular decisions. It is rather to decide whether the decision they have taken is in accordance with our principles of decision making. Okay, so the two, they can take unpopular decisions, but they can do it in accordance with the principles. In this case, the challenge is that the decision taken has not been proportional to the desired outcome. There is a presumption in favour of openness in decision making, which it will be argued has not been followed. And the final one is of a consideration of alternatives and other options. We do have a substantial chunk of green paper here, and having been through parts A and B of this, I do think we can conduct the meeting in public without needing to refer to the exempt sections. If members feel that they do want to refer to those, if we can save that particular discussion until we've covered everything that can be dealt with in public, that would be desirable. And in fact, because the cabinet report has now been released in full. I do feel that most of the figures are now in the public domain, and having reviewed the exempt sections, I can tell you that they just provide very detailed justification for the figures in the cabinet report. So if I do hope, I mean, the point of scrutiny is to be transparent and to take decisions in public as far as possible. So if we can stick to that. The procedure I'm going to follow is to invite Cllr Ed Gretton to open to speak to the call-in. Members can then ask questions of Ed. I will then invite James McGinlay to respond. And again, we will, if members have any questions for James, we'll take those. We will then go to discussion, and members of Cllr may well wish to add to what James says, but I think, you know, that there's an awful lot in here that if we read it properly should say those questions. At the end of our discussion, we have the option either of asking Cabinet to reconsider their decision. Now, if we do that, we have to put forward, I feel, a reason as to why we wish them to reconsider. If that then fails to secure the support of the members of the Commission as a whole, then by default, the Cabinet decision stands. I think that's clear enough. So I'm going to start by asking Ed to open. Far away.
Thank you very much, Peter, and happy to explain the thinking behind this call-in of the Cabinet decision, and also take any questions from members of the Commission as you may have. This relates to the waiver of the clawback monies. I think we heard it was about £72 million, which the council is effectively giving Cllr by way of financial support to enable the regenerations to proceed. So there are several points, process points we've set out in our call-in, which is from me, but also from Councillor David Dean and Councillor Adam Bush as well. If I perhaps start with the second point, which is in your call-in papers, Chair. So just to explain that, which is how the financial assessment, which forms the basis of the decisions, is extremely out of date. Now, ordinarily, a financial assessment, a financial viability assessment might be a few months out of date, but this case, two factors are relevant. First of all, it's about 1.5 years out of date. We've had the COVID pandemic. So when Cllr wrote with the help of Savills, I believe, their financial assessment setting out why they were saying the project was no longer viable, that was in March 2020, just when the pandemic and the first lockdown was happening. And although the council claims to have reviewed that financial assessment and brought in its own advisors, SQW, if you look at the date of the financial assessment by the council, that was in June 2020. So that was about the bleakest possible time when businesses were closed down, retail was closed down, schools were closed down, shops, the whole economy was basically closed down, estate agents were closed down. So it was such a long time ago, and it was in such bleak economic circumstances. There's no way this council can make a safe, reliable, proportionate decision when you have a financial assessment that was formulated in the most extreme times in the first quarter of the previous financial year, in the worst quarter of the pandemic. So that's the very first point. And the members of the Commission may see that there was one key point which seems to have been underlined in your own call-in papers. In the ones I've got, it was at page 8, paragraph 2.48, but you'll see there's some underlining. It talks unbelievably, Chair and members of the Commission, the council seems to acknowledge that there does need to be a fresh financial assessment so it can decide if the level of the clawback waiver, the financial support of £72 million back to Cllr is right, or if the 600 homes is right, extra homes in High Path, if those are the right decisions. But generally, you need to see a full financial assessment before you make the decision on whether the 5% clawback waiver is justified, or whether 1% or 2.5% or half of that amount. You just can't possibly take a safe, reliable decision as a council when your financial assessments from both sides, from Cllr and the council, were formulated in March, April, May, June 2020, when the whole entire economy was pretty much closed down. It was the bleakest of assessments, and the council's report seems to acknowledge it does need to be one, but it makes little sense to have a fresh financial assessment after you make those decisions. You need to have that up-to-date, accurate, reliable assessment before you decide on whether £72 million waiver at 5% clawback is relevant, because you might be able to justify 1% or 2.5% being half that amount. That's nearly a whole year's council tax, which the council seems to be giving by way of financial support back to Cllr. And similarly, the second component, and you'll see the rest of the call in then follows, because the A1 point on proportionality is about assessing whether £72 million, that level of financial support, is justified. And of course, what I've said is you just can't understand that. And although you may refer to an earnout, which the officers seem to be trying to include, saying if the project does make a return in the end, then the council might share in that and might get some of it back. But we all know that these earnouts are notoriously difficult because the payer, in this case Cllr, controls its own accounting policies, controls its own costs, sets out how it calculates its own profit. So it's extremely rare for these earnouts ever to pay out. They're just not seen as advisable or reliable in any way. And similarly, there's another reference to additional community infrastructure levy, I think £20 million being applicable. And again, I don't think that's really a relevant consideration. I mean, community infrastructure levy is not an upside for regeneration, it's for the essential infrastructure for residents. And even if we were to take that additional SIL money of £20 million into account, that reduces the financial support to Cllr from 72 million to still more than 50 million, which is an enormous sum of money. And you just can't make a safe decision when you've got a report that's so out of date and written in such bleak circumstances. So the second point, which is critical, of course, is 608 homes. Originally, there were going to be there are 608 homes in High Path today. Now there's going to be up to 2,300 homes in High Path because of the changes to the arrangement, which the councils now seems to be agreeing. And I'm not sure how that generates, as the council's estates plan says, is the stated aim is to improve the community. But if you move a community from 608 homes, High Path, to 2,300, it's very difficult to see how that's going to improve the community. There's a real risk of extremely high density, overcrowded tower block housing, the sort of things you might see maybe Elephant Castle or Hackney, some of the estates there which need regeneration. Seems to be the council's now looking at building those in High Path. And but these, you can't make a decision on whether 100 homes are needed or 50 homes, or in this case, moving from 608 to 2,300 homes. You just can't decide that unless you've got a safe, reliable financial assessment. So that's where we're coming from in matter of proportionality. And I mentioned the stated homes. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you, Peter.
We have questions for Cllr Gretton just on his presentation.
Thank you, Cllr Gretton. Can I ask your view on the 2014 contractual agreement?
Yeah, so I'm not aware. My understanding is that there was a stock transfer in 2010, and but I wouldn't expect that stock transfer to regulate and provide the legal framework for the regeneration. It was this regeneration was agreed in 2014, and that's when we saw the 10 commitments, which included matters such as Cllr would ensure that the maintenance was carried out. But really, I don't know what the documents were. I haven't seen any contracts from 2014 when the regeneration was discussed and the whole project was formulated. We saw, I think, Councillor Stephen Lambritis standing up and with the 10 commitments from Cllr and talking about the regeneration project. It was a huge project, £1.5 billion, £2 billion regeneration. Really, we need to ask the questions as a commission, what contracts were in place in 2014? If the contracts were, what's that list of documents look like? Did they provide a contractual commitment for Cllr to deliver the project? And if they did, why are we gifting Cllr £72 million and 600 extra homes now on High Path? And if there weren't any documents, or if there were documents that didn't include those proper commitment provisions, which you now see in the first operating clause of the heads of terms, the question needs to be asked, why wasn't that contract put in place properly in 2014 for what's, you know, one of the country's largest housing regeneration projects? It's just, I don't understand why the 2014 contracts haven't been sort of set out and reviewed by us.
Thank you. Perhaps we can pose that question to Cabinet Member as we move on.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ed, Councillor Gretton. Just got one reflection on a point you made about the condition of the new builds being made. You made a reference to them being equivalent to Elephant and Castle. I assume you're referring to the old Elephant and Castle properties. Have you visited the new properties on High Path? And could you give an assessment of the quality of those compared to the existing build?
Yeah, I think what I'm referring to is just the density. I think some of the historic housing estates, Elephant and Castle and Hackney, are known in housing to have some of the highest density, hyper density, super density with the tower blocks, where you've got a number of households over 1 acre of, you know, 100, 200, 300, that type of thing. So that was, I think, behind the references. I think some of the question then needs to be raised, if you are building that kind of density in High Path today, where there's 600 homes and now building, I think, 2000 up to 2,300, that's an enormous change on the whole community, on the neighborhood. So when the stated aim of the whole regeneration project is to build a better community, you'd expect to see quite a lot of assessment and professional officer commentary and Cllr about trying to reassure people, saying, if you're moving from 600 homes in High Path to 2,300, how is that actually going to adversely impact the residents and communities? Is it going to be, as you suggest, a really good offering, or is there a real danger of overcrowding in High Path, which there may seem to be?
Sorry, colleagues. No, thank you for the answer. So it'd be good if you wouldn't mind just clarifying again on your content with the quality of the build. But again, I know you from your past comments and from having chats outside that you're a big supporter of business and local economy. Would an increase in the footfall of that high street support all those businesses in the area?
Has to be about balance. So yes, having more homes and having better homes is going to be excellent for the communities, and having a greater number of houses. But if you push that number from 600 or, you know, up to extremely high, that's why the Mayor of London issued papers, I think, last year saying it's a balancing exercise. Up to a certain point, you're going to benefit the community, you've got the better footfall, but after a certain point, when you cross that threshold and you have housing which is far too dense, then it creates problems of its own, antisocial behaviour. People are, and it actually starts to adversely, you know, compromise the community. People don't want to invest. You have all sorts of antisocial crime problems as well. That's what you really want to avoid. So yes, more homes is good, but don't push it too far. You start to cause problems which you don't want to see in Wimbledon.
No, and finally, I completely understand. I mean, we all champion law and order and want to see antisocial behaviour as minimum. My question back then, what is that number, in your opinion?
Well, I think that's what's got to be assessed. We haven't seen the plans yet. We've seen plans for 600. We know the plans for the homes that are already there today. We know there's plans for, I think, 1,600, 1,700 homes. We've seen those set out by way of outline planning permission. But what we haven't seen is how you change that number by 600 extra homes in High Path and move it to 2,300. Nobody set out the plans for that yet. But you'd expect to see, one, the plans for the design, how the green space is still retained, how people will be able to have free open community space and everything else, and how the amenity is adversely impacted by that. But we haven't got any information on that yet, and we don't know if 2,003 homes in High Path is the right number or the wrong number. There would seem to be a very high risk of overpopulation and extreme overcrowding. You can't really formulate a decision until you assess the need and have a proportionate decision as to how many extra homes you might need to allow Cllr to build in order to make sure the project gets going. It might just be an extra 50 or an extra 100 homes. Even that's worth a lot of money. But to start saying you need to move from 600 to 2,300, it's such a big delta you really need proper reports and proper assessments on the homes, on their quality, on the amenity, but also on the impact on the community as well before we can make a safe decision.
Butler.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ed, for your answers there. I don't think you quite answered on the point that Aidan was touching on, and the quality of the homes, the new builds in High Path. And just to follow on from that, where you think in your thought process here, you're including the main priority of here is to decrease the overcrowding in the current households. As a councillor in Abbey, the 96 homes that were originally put here and subsequent increase in overcrowding, I see it immediate and a very dire need for these homes. So I think that first question there, and where in there's 3 parts here. The second part, where in your considerations in these extra homes was for the community in this densification is also an increase in affordable homes as well. I'd like you to address that and where your thought process is on that. But also, you're asking, we haven't had time to see what levels of homes versus the benefits to the community. But in here, we've seen evidence of this 12-month process, these workshops about densification, these 5 workshops, and an extremely detailed vision here about the benefits, the balances there are of the funding for the regeneration in total, and in detail, going almost tens of homes by tens of homes in here, the densification and the justification for that. I think in terms of the thought process, from my point of view, the work has been done here. Why do you say it's not been?
Thanks very much. Could you just clarify, of the additional homes in High Path, how many are you saying have already been completed? Beyond the 608 already in place?
The current first phase, 124 homes, I think is the number, yeah.
So 124. So that moves the total in High Path from 608 to 730 odd homes. And that's still a tiny fraction. So those homes may well appear to have been built already and with a high degree of quality. But when you see that number increasing from the 730 odd up to 2,300, and you see, and we haven't even seen the final plans for that, it's very hard for us to say, just because a very small number have already been built of 50 to 100 and they seem to be okay. We haven't seen the planning consents yet for taking up to the full level of 2,300, so we just don't know what they're going to look like, and the whole impact of the risk of overcrowding, I think, and having a very high density in accordance with the Mayor of London's paper on this, I think issued last year, would really need to be taken into account, just to see where that threshold is. You may well have homes that appear to be new, but as I say, once you start overcrowding and having a very high hyperdensity, then it can create an awful lot of problems in the community. And then you have to balance it against, yes, you have new homes with additional football, but yeah, a quantity which starts to adversely impact neighbourhoods. So on the affordable homes, I do appreciate that the level of affordable homes, I think, built to date in Merton is pretty low. And of the new homes, we all support, we want more affordable homes. We want the right affordable homes, though. And I think out of the new homes that have been built, there's a good healthy percentage of those which would appear to be in the affordable homes bracket, and they're making use of government schemes, all the relevant government national schemes for making, helping people get on the housing ladder and so on. So I think that's positive, but it just comes back to the communities which end up being built from the quantity of the homes. So that's why you should never rush into a decision to build an extra 2,300 homes where there's currently 600 homes without a proper assessment of all these good things you're talking about, like affordable housing offering and new quality homes. But at what point, where does that threshold lie? What do the experts say about that? And at what point does it start creating overcrowding and a major risk? And again, the regeneration itself, of course, is extremely positive. But I think the point is, contracts should have really been put in place in 2014 when the whole project was discussed, and we thought it had been agreed. And certainly, if you look at Clarion's statutory accounts and press releases and all the meetings everyone's been at for years, Cllr have always been saying they thought the project was definitely going ahead, and it's only just now because we find out that there wasn't a proper contractual commitment put in place to enable the regeneration, to hold Cllr into account and make them deliver the regeneration. It's because of that now the whole regeneration is threatened, and that's why the council's being asked to gift this £72 million plus an extra 600 homes high density in High Path to support Cllr to get it over the line, because regeneration is a very positive thing, but it looks like the proper contractual arrangements were not put in place for whatever reason in 2014.
Christie, please.
Thank you, Chair. In his initial 5 minutes, Cllr Gretton spent a lot of time making the point that he feels the financial assessment on which this proposed decision is based on is out of date, and yet he referenced the specific line in the report in front of us that says that before we enter into a contract agreeing to this, a further financial assessment will take place. So could he just explain again why he has a problem with the Cabinet taking a decision in principle that could expedite and finally bring about these much needed regenerations when exactly what he seems to be asking for has already been agreed to? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question. I think there was already a great deal of movement in the numbers, and when you saw, I think the project was shown to 1 minute producing a well north of £100 million surplus, and the next minute shifts of hundreds of millions of pounds based on projections, and it's the financial assessment and the viability gap is not just an add-on. And in normal times, maybe you'd have it and it'd be a business case scenario. But what we're talking about here is a very different sort of financial assessment. It's absolutely fundamental, because the point is it allows the country's biggest housing association and housing provider to suddenly say, actually, that leading regeneration, not just for the borough, but for London, which everyone's been talking about as a committed project for the last 6 years or so, we now want to backtrack and say we're not going to deliver that on the basis of a financial assessment. So that financial assessment and the viability reports become absolutely critical importance. So they've got to be reliable. So I think our point is that you can't just make a decision and say, oh, well, we're going to take somebody's word for it that the project's not deliverable when you're a £1 billion organisation with an operating surplus of £300 million a year. And now you're asking the Borough of Merton for an extra £72 million. You can't just really take their word for it and say, well, of course, you're happy to gift you £72 million or an extra 600 homes in High Path alone. You've really got, it's such an important thing of critical fundamental importance. You have to have an up-to-date, accurate financial report and assessment that wasn't written in the bleakest of times when all the estate agents and the whole economy was closed, but is updated, not just with a few tweaks, but fundamentally written again. And only then can really the council, I think, make a decision whether or not, a 5% clawback waiver at £72 million is relevant, or something of 1 or 2% might be more appropriate to get the project over the line, or instead of 2,300 homes in High Path, maybe you say, well, you just have an extra 50 homes. But you can't really start to make those decisions and make the assessments until you've got this critically important financial assessment in place. And that's what, you can't just have that as an add-on after you make decisions. You have to have that and then spend a month or two assessing it.
Polar now.
Thank you, Chair. Ed has made some good points on the legal position and on the finances, and I hope we'll have a chance to ask officers about these questions. To answer Billy's point, of course, finances is a fundamental point here. To argue you can look at the detail of that after you've made this fundamental decision is clearly misconceived. But I wanted to add a caveat now. The discussion with Aidan and Ben proceed on the basis, and Ed actually, proceed on the basis that they will get planning permission for this change. It feels like a gun is being held to the head of the council because planning permission hasn't been granted yet for these new buildings. And I give notice to Clarion now, I'd like to hear what their attitude will be if they don't get planning permission. because we can't assume planning permission has been granted. This is not a planning committee, but the discussion then fell into that because we're almost assuming they will get planning permission. That is clearly not the position, and we should bear that in mind. And Cllr, please, I'll give you notice. What will you do if you don't get planning permission? Thank you.
And I have to say, in the detail, it does say that obviously planning permission cannot be, taken for granted by any means. Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Ed, you mentioned the changes in property prices. What is the difference in land registry prices between April 2020 and today? And isn't it the case that a new viability study could have taken account of a house price change, which would still allow redevelopment to happen? It just mean that Merton could have benefited financially. Thank you, Chair.
My understanding is that the land registry indexes have increased by many percent, not just 1 or 2%, but actually 5% or thereabouts, possibly more now since these reports were written. But there's all kinds of assumptions that then have to be taken into account about not just the overall land registry index, which have increased very significantly, but actually Wimbledon as a whole. There's been a lot of reports in the housing sector about how well Wimbledon's doing in terms of the recovery post-pandemic, and how Wimbledon's a great place where people like to live. It's a greener part of London and so on. And so there could be different assumptions, even more favourable assumptions to report. And that's just yet another reason why you can't make a decision as fundamental as this on a gift of £72 million to the Housing Association without taking into account exactly these sorts of land registry indices that you're talking about, which have swung, I think, 5% at least since the report was written. These are big changes, and any number of these will have the ability to swing the project return, development return by a very considerable amount. And actually, you might kind of think, well, now I know that we don't need to rush into gifting £72 million to Cllr overnight. Maybe you don't need to consider that, or that's why we're saying this has got to be reviewed again by the Cabinet, sent back for reconsideration after exactly this sort of factors have been properly taken into account. We have a fresh, up-to-date, reliable report.
Okay, Councillor Mundy.
Thank you, Chair. And Ed, thank you for your responses so far. I was just a bit curious about your reference to the London plan. So I've done a bit of digging, and I understand paragraph B of policy D3 details that higher densities should be sought for sites well connected to jobs, services, amenities and infrastructure by public transport, walking or cycling. My question is, do you feel that the High Path is a site of well connected to jobs, services, amenities, infrastructure, public transport, walking or cycling?
Actually, if I could just answer that with a question, because what determines how you treat the high densities of the number of households per acre. So could you what are we talking about? Acre or hectare? Yeah. So what's the number of households currently? And when you move to 2,300 on High Path, how many households are we talking per hectare or per acre? Do you know? Because that determines how you then treat the high density, the super density, the hyper densities, and all this sort of thing. So, but that's exactly my point. And you need exactly that kind of analysis, and that's not a one-liner. That's a 50-page report with assessing why you need all these extra houses and the sort of impacts it's going to have, and how that factors in and reconciles not just with the London plan, but the Mayor of London's recent report on on the risks associated with higher density housing. You can't just wash over that and think, oh, we'll approve it without a report. Ordinarily, the council would be looking into this in considerable detail before it suddenly rushes overnight, as it's doing now, it seems, to 2,003 homes in High Path when there's only 600 there at the moment.
I'm going to make the point here that I think officers can deal with this point about current and proposed densities, rather than our speculating. Let me to Nick next, please.
Following on from Councillor Christie, who referenced your opening comments, could you perhaps just elaborate further on the dangers of an earnout?
Yep. My understanding is that typically the professionals will always advise, if you want to have an earnout, which is what the council seems to be referencing here, because the council's saying, look, don't worry about gifting the £72 million to Cllr, because if at the end of the day the project turns out to make a bit of a return, we're going to get some of that back, and that's why it's acceptable as a matter of balancing to agree this now. That's a bit of an add-on. The danger of that is what advisors will always say: if you want to have an earn out, have it, but never ever rely on it, because they're commonly litigated and they're commonly declined. And that is simply because the books and records, the accounting records, and how you account for your costs and how you deal with your accounting policies and all that sort of thing are controlled, in this case, by Cllr. So they will be able to say, okay, well, here are all our costs, and there's, allocations of cost there and recharging there, and somebody spent 3 months on the project there, so I'm putting all this out. So the costs get inflated, and it's very easy for the payor, who's under legal obligation to pay that earn out, to actually set out the accounts as they'd like to set them out, with higher costs, lower revenue, and then say at the end of the day, oh, sorry, there's no, not now, hasn't triggered the earn out. And these are commonly litigated, commonly put to external accountants, but they have to test back to the accounting policies of the payor, in this case Cllr, and payors typically win when it comes to contested proceedings and earnouts, which is why advisors always say you should never ever rely on them. They're extremely high risk and often unlikely to pay out. And that's why I was concerned to see this as a sort of a balancing exercise, to say, oh, we've got a nice earnout, and that's why we should rush it through, when actually these earnouts are notorious for actually not paying out in practice.
Councillor Butler.
Thank you, Chair. I'm struggling to, because it seems like, I want you to clarify this, that risk for you trumps everything for you. That, the potential affordable homes, the solving of the overcrowding, all of these issues are trumped by this uncertainty. And just on this point, Chair, I would ask you at this point, because I could listen to you, Ed, talk about earnouts, and it sounds wonderful all day, but I'm not an expert on this. So maybe at some point getting council officers in here would be useful. Thank you.
In response to that, do I take it you're agreeing then that you think you want to find out more about this? So your advice is put the decision on hold for now. Let's have this good debate about affordable housing, about earnouts. You want to know what the true financial position is. So am I right in saying that you're indicating a degree of support, that you want to put it on hold whilst these very important matters are given full proper consideration?
Well, it says here that they'll have another financial thing just before they go into it. I think that's what they were planning to do just beforehand. So, which is Billy's point earlier.
Let me take Councillor McCabe, and then I think I want to hear from officers, unless we have further questions.
Thank you, Chair. And just actually following up on that point, I think if I want advice about how these things work, I would listen to the experts. I would listen to those with an independence of mind, as opposed to somebody who is pursuing a political agenda. And I was interested in the remarks that we got at the beginning, where we had a reference to the Elephant and Castle and Hackney. I didn't hear any reference to Westminster Council, which of course was responsible for the Grenfell block, which was densely occupied. I was interested in the economic analysis of Councillor Gretton. It sounded wonderful. We were facing the bleakest of times, he said. And yet, since then, we've seen an increase in inflation, a world shortage of building materials, which is actually now reflected in the St Helier costings and is going to cause major problems for the new hospital. We've seen our Prime Minister propose that we have a high wage economy. So is it the bleakest of times, or are there problems that are coming over the horizon? And again, my feeling is that in such uncertain times, that it's far better to have a mechanism where you can analyse the figures independently without a political axe to grind, and then take excuse me, I listened to you.
You're the only one that have
I
made
didn't-
this political,
I
as ever the
didn't
hatchet man comes to
interrupt
the
you.
aid.
So if you
I'm
would
going
respect,
to make the point here, please, that I didn't at the outset say let's avoid political point scoring because I didn't feel it was necessary. But you know full well that that this is not the appropriate to bring in,
Chair,
political points.
I'm expressing a view. I'm entitled to express that view without being interrupted. And if you wish to chair this meeting properly, the first thing you will do is say, please do not interrupt members when they are speaking. That's the protocol in the council chamber and in committee meetings. I hope you will continue to do that for the rest of the evening.
Is there a question here, Peter?
Well, my question is, it's actually no different to what I have already heard, which is questions have been asked and not answered. Billy's question has yet to be answered, and comments have been made, and there's been no attempt by you as chair to say, is there a question here? In fact, at one stage, the answer to a question was, let me ask you a question. That was directed at Aidan. So no, there's no specific question other than I'm looking forward to hearing people with expertise and independence tell us their opinion.
Well, I think we
A very quick response, yeah, very quick response.
But Ed, keep it.
Yeah, Councillor McCabe mentioned the ground floor. I think it's not in Westminster, it's Kensington and Chelsea, just to correct you there. On the political agenda, actually, we're not talking about politics now. We're talking about the economics and the financial position. So you don't just hand over £72 million to somebody like you're doing simply because somebody asked. I know we've got the festive season approaching, and I'm going to definitely come to you and ask you what I want for Christmas. I know that, Councillor McCabe. You seem extremely generous. I mean, £72 million, just so you know, is nearly a whole year's council tax. It's an enormous sum of money, and you should be extremely careful before handing that sort of sum of money over. A proper financial report would always be advisable, in my suggestion.
Good. Well, let's hear now from the people who should know. James McGinlay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to members of the scrutiny panel. I thought it might just be helpful to sort of describe the process we've gone through, both from the 2014 period through to the 2018, and then more latterly the 2020 period, where this particular viability assessment is in play. 2014 was the suspension of the decent home standard to allow for consideration of estate regeneration, working with the Cllr housing, and that was to deliver estate regeneration as a mechanism to deliver the decent homes. So rather than refurbishment, it would have been through new build, and that was something that, in terms of dealing with some of those other issues in the estates, I think it was recognised that they were tired. The quality of the housing as well as environment was tired, and there was also the need to address issues around overcrowding, sustainability, and we worked with with Cllr, who also worked very considerably through consultation with local residents, to produce the 2018 approved planning applications that were seeking to largely demolish on the High Path and Eastfields estate and on the Ravensbury estate, some demolition, new build, but also a greater proportion of refurbished properties there. I think members can refer back to that to see what the actual numbers that were approved back in 2018, and I think it's circa, and apologies, I may look to my colleagues, but I think it's around 2,700 units that were approved across the three estates, but we'll happily clarify that. And that is already approved, that already has consent. It was a outline consent in many areas, and detailed applications are coming in. So I think it's important to recognise there is an existing planning permission that is being worked through. And in terms of the question of additional housing above that level that's mentioned in the 2020 onward work, that is absolutely, Councillor is absolutely right. That will be the consideration for Planning Applications Committee. This is not in any way fettering Planning Application Committee's ultimate decision. And quite rightly, it will be a question for Cllr as to what they will do. But we've entered into those discussions in good faith, because in 2020, when Cllr did write to us, it was a bit of a shock. but I think it was better to get the honesty of what the issues were on the table. And they were quite considerable, because you'll see that the swing from a healthy positive situation to a considerable deficit was something that we had to address. Officers sought external assistance for that, and there was a forensic analysis of their business case. So while there's getting on for 400 pages presented today, that also belies the fact that my company, James Kinnersly here, who is from our external advisors, SQW, there were a forensic analysis of the figures presented by Cllr in the business plan. I think the first thing as officers we had to ascertain was, did we believe, could we validate what they were saying? And we were guided by our advisors. And yes, we did see that the information provided did justify the analysis by Cllr and that there had been a significant change. The question then was, what do we do about that? Because Cllr were very much of the view that that deficit was too great for them to continue with the estate regeneration. And clearly there was a benefit to residents by having new build homes rather than refurbished homes, albeit that is a fallback position that decent homes through refurbishment would take place. I think it was what we did. It was as an officer group, we looked at options, and their options. But it's how did we improve on that deficit? And the work we did, both with external advisors and with Cllr, lifted many stones. Some of those were to see what were the efficiencies through construction methodology, through supply chains. And those weren't just about what happens in 2020. It was based on industry standard processes, because this is it's a decade plus project. So it wasn't about pricing in 2020. It's got to look and see what happens during the lifetime of a large project like this. And we do fully acknowledge that estate regeneration is complex and can have ups and downs during the period of its build out. I think what we recognise is that there was no silver bullet in the figures, so there was not one element that either in itself was the most significant in terms of the deterioration in the performance of the business plan, but also that there was no one solution that in its own would bring it back into a positive position. And indeed, if you look through the information in detail, you'll see that actually it still is at a considerable deficit of minus 65 million. Now, I appreciate that the queries about the validity of the timing of that, and I will bow to my colleagues' better knowledge working in the industry day in, day out on that. But I think what we sought to do was always be able to effectively, compare apples with apples using industry standard processes and not bespoke ones. I think that's right and proper, because it's also one that we use when we're considering planning applications. We've got to be able to have a benchmark that we use when we're determining the viability of projects. You'll see that there's been a mixture of different items that have changed they've reduced the deficit, but certainly not wiped it out. And one of the considerations was the community infrastructure levy. You'll see that the council determined that wasn't something that they were going to consider it being in scope at all. And in terms of the clawback, we were left with a stark consideration, which is if the estate regeneration doesn't go ahead, we won't receive that clawback. And in its own, it would make a considerable dent into the reducing the deficit and bring the project to a point where Cllr determined that was something that they would be able to get approval for and move forward on. I think I'd probably like to clarify that it's a suspension of the clawback. It's not a waiver. I think that's I'm sure if Louise was able to reach out and hit me in the shoulder at the moment, she'd say that there's legal definitions there, but this is not about waiving it. There is a mechanism in which, should the project go to break even and beyond that, the clawback would start to be repaid. I think that my sort of summary in this, but very much happy to pass to James for the detail of it, is that we've got to realise that in 2014, when the Decent Homes was suspended, the commitment from Cllr was to deliver decent homes. When they came in 2018 with their planning application, the question has been asked, what was the legal mechanism to do that? We treated them as we would any other developer, and that is that they have a sound business plan that was analysed during the planning process and deemed to be in order. And indeed, members may be familiar that there are review mechanisms within the planning approval at various stages relating to different phases, because the planning approval replaced housing, the affordable housing, and increased the number of bedrooms as part of the commitment to tenants. But actually, in total numbers, there wasn't a significant increase in affordable number of units, but there's a review mechanism to do that. So we have to see what is the balance between making this happen, incentivizing Cllr to get on and do it, and what are the appropriate legal mechanisms to do that. We believe that we've got a robust analysis. We do agree that it needs refreshed, but I just want to emphasise and again have the experts talk in more detail about that. That the viability assessments are not based at one moment in time. They are going to be refreshed, and we recognise that there will be a need to do that on an annual basis during the lifetime of this project. That we need to do what is right in terms of maintaining the quality of the environment in the new build, at the same time as effectively requiring Cllr to get on, initially do the replacement homes for our affordable housing tenants, and then to move on to do the new build private sales. The element of analysis of that business plan will be considerable. We have clear definitions of what we look to see what are allowable costs. And it's a tried and tested method within the development industry, whether it be overage agreements or others, where there is a transparency and an openness to that, and a well-recognised process for that. So I hope that addresses the questions. The planning permission hasn't been given. Cllr are consulting on the changes in the high path, but it will be ultimately for the Planning Applications Committee to determine whether that is satisfactory. And I wouldn't want to prejudge, and that is a risk that Cllr have taken on. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Just let me check, James, is there anything you really want to add there, or take questions first? Yeah.
Nothing specifically, but I'm very happy to take questions on the detailed points, just in terms of what members want to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the officers for that extra information. And I think you might have addressed it, but if the officer here is the appropriate person to answer this question, or whether it should be someone specifically from the planning team, I don't know. But could he give us an indication as to whether the proposed additional homes on the high path, how that would relate to existing recommendations around housing density and overcrowding? Thanks.
Chair, I'm going to define to somebody who's got better knowledge on the planning process than myself.
Thank you, Councillor. 2 points there was overcrowding and density. The overcrowding issue is around the housing conditions of people already living on the estates. And what the current approved plans do is rehouse existing residents with new homes. They've got more bedrooms, more habitable rooms to deal with the overcrowding of people already there. Density is nothing more than a calculation of what gets built at the end of the day. What we look at in planning, there is a density matrix in the London plan that often gets referred to. We've also adopted the state's local plan, and we consider townscape with the streets, the size of parks being created, and the quality of architecture and spaces between them. So the council's already approved that. You'll have seen in the information pack tonight some of the process that we went through in the workshops to determine what may be possible for densifying high path, and I clarify possible because that is just being consulted on with residents now. And what's being consulted with residents is a bit less than what you see in your pack tonight. for various other design reasons. So we expect that will come in as planning and be determined on its normal process. So density is just a calculation. We are more about the townscape and the quality of life of people there.
Chair, I'd just like to ask James from SQW to tell us something about his firm and their expertise in this field and why they are qualified to be independent financial advisors to the council. And I'd also like him to address the issue that we've just been told that, you know, basically whatever you do, the people whose books you're checking will pull the wool over your eyes and the council will get no benefit from the fees that I'm sure you will be picking up for undertaking this work.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'll address your first point or first question first. It's probably the simpler one. So I've been working in planning and development for 10 years. Majority of that spent in consultancy, predominantly working in London and the central London boroughs. I've also spent some time previously working for a developer, so working client side and understanding how the development process works. Currently, majority of my clients are registered providers and councils. So the majority of my work is public sector. I've, like I said, developer experience previously. I have extensive experience working through the planning system and the viability in planning and how that has evolved quite significantly and dramatically over the last 10 years. In terms of the firm which I work for, SQW, I joined at the beginning of 2020. They were previously known as BBP Regeneration. There was a specialist property team, BBP Regeneration, who merged with SQW back in 2019. So the name BBP might be familiar to some councillors because my colleagues were acting for Merton Council for some years now, both pre-planning, undertaking viability reviews during the planning process and working with Cllr at the time through the Section 106 process to agree a financial model which was consistent with planning policy, guidance, industry best practice. And that model is really at the heart of the business plan and the business case and everything we're reviewing today. And I just, avoidance of doubt as well, I don't work for Cllr in any other capacity and haven't done previously. And my senior colleague, Stephen Pritchard, director of SQW, acted prior to myself joining SQW and has been involved in this process the entire way through. So we've got consistency in corporate memory. This is not just me coming in over the last 18 months and working with senior colleagues. So hopefully that answers your first question, but happy to provide more details. In terms of the second point around Cllr pulling the wool over our eyes at a later point in time, and I think Councillor Gretton referred to this point around kind of earn-out, I think was the term. This process is a 15-year development programme. I think that's the first point in time, or first point to make. The planning process, embedded in the planning process, and embedded in the planning permission in the Section 106, includes mechanisms to capture any changes through time. So already in the permission scheme that you have approved, or your colleagues will have approved previously, at certain points in time, in line with industry guidance, with the government's policy, government guidance, GLA policy and guidance, and your own approach, there will be particular points in time where, through the planning process, even irrespective of this, you, Merton, will get to review Cllr's books to look at what the outturn of the development is. That has to be substantiated with evidence. Those review mechanisms will take places at points in time where it will be evidence of sales receipts. That is land registry data. That is not data that can be fudged. That is on the public record. That is evidence of building contracts, of tender prices. You'll be on the point of forecasting. It's about saying what is actually being delivered and incurred. So it's all undertaken on an open book basis for Cllr, as it is for any number of developers, registered providers, councils undertaking development all across the UK. So I think that principle is enshrined in planning. It is clearly a principle we're looking to also embed here with this proposed suspension of the clawback mechanism. It is a suspension, as James pointed out and is detailed in the report. We are proposing a final review at the end of the development process, again, which will be substantiated by evidence, which I should hasten to add, will be continually gathered and collated throughout the 15-year process. It won't just be a final point at the end because of all of these planning review mechanisms we have in place and the recommendation of the annual business plan review. That evidence will be collated regularly, but the final accounting will be done at the end. And we've also proposed a further protection of the council that mechanism, the final accounting takes place at 95% of sales. If it was to take place at, say, 100% of sales, a cynical developer might say, we'll always hold one back. We'll never do that final review mechanism. If you ensure that that review takes place at 95%, that's 5% of the sales still on their books. There'll be an element of forecast values for those. That can all be evidenced and substantiated. And again, this is all in line of industry best practice. So I am confident that the approach that's being taken here, this is not a special circumstance coming up with a new mechanism. This is something that is tried and tested and has worked elsewhere. Hopefully that provides an answer. Thank you.
Yeah, James, just one question, simple question really. You calculate density in 2 dimensions, but you can build in 3? Yes?
Not sure I quite follow the question. Apologies.
Well, we calculate habitable rooms per hectare, don't we?
Yes.
Yes. Is that not the area on the ground, or?
Oh, sorry, apologies. Was there a question about density?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not sure I'm the best place to answer density. Can I hand over to Paul? Apologies.
Sorry, Chair. Was that clarification as to how we model density?
Really here is you can increase density by going higher. Yes.
You can increase density by going high, but you don't always have to do that. You can do it by other ways. So yeah, basic density calculation, it was measured earlier. It can be number of people in an area. When it comes to planning, it's number of rooms, habitable rooms per hectare, or sometimes units per hectare, depending what the methodology is. You can have high density schemes that are not high rise. Eastfields Estate, for example, is a high density estate, but it is not high rise because the plots are small and narrow. Rooms are small, built back in the day. So you can densify by having smaller units, or sometimes to increase density, you do have to go high because you're trying to achieve other aims. So for example, the overcrowding issues we mentioned earlier, people already living there needs bigger units and more bedrooms. So that will lead to an increase in height if it can't be met on the land. Should also maybe add in the estate's local plan, we've also built in guidance on the size of streets, building to building distance. There's a new path at a new park at High Path. All of these things mitigate the feeling of density because you're providing space for people at street level. Yeah, thanks.
Councillor Cllr.
I would repeat my caveat. This is not a planning committee. We really shouldn't go down that path about planning and density, I don't think here. James from SQW, can I refer you to to paragraphs 2.48 and the next few paragraphs after that in your report, where you talk about financing costs. And you too show some skepticism that in April 2020, Clarion could estimate their financing costs at 5% when they had an oversubscribed bond issue a couple of months later, paying 1.88% over 15-year. You say rightly, it's not to criticize you at all, might I? You say rightly that we need to interrogate this. I've tried to see how the interrogation went, but rather than me tell you how little I found, I'd like to ask you, are you satisfied now that interrogation took place? And if so, can you explain why? Not now, but because this goes to credibility, how they could say in April 2020 that their finance costs were 5%.
Thank you, Councillor. Yes, absolutely. So worth pointing out that 5% finance rate was also the finance rate assumed in the financial model. Apologies. Is that slightly louder? Sorry, thank you. So that 5% finance rate was in the financial model as of 2008 Planning Permission, as originally approved and agreed. And again, I'd like to just draw attention to the fact that that financial model, the assumptions, inputs, everything, how it was all structured was in line with government guidance, government policy, GLA guidance, GLA policy, and indeed local policy and guidance. Finance rates which are assumed and are modelled are done on an industry standard basis rather than specific and bespoke to a developer or housing association, whoever the applicant might be at the time, or whoever the lead developer is here, being Cllr. Yes, some relatively low cost or low yielding bonds were issued by Cllr, and we were aware of that. We challenged on that basis. I think it's worth bearing in mind, again, we have no control, or Merton has no control over how Cllr finances. This could be internal sources of finance, equity, debt. It could be external sources of bank lending. That lending will always come at a cost, even internal lending and financing, where there will always be a differentiation between the interest rate at which finance is sourced and how it is deployed within the group. Industry standard for development finance within the planning viability process would be between 6 and 7%. 5% is quite competitive. That bears clearly an influencing factor there is the fact that this is a Cllr, they're a housing association, their balance sheet is what it is. This is a regeneration project. I think it's worth, so if this was solely an affordable housing scheme with no private sales, then we would be anticipating a lower rate of finance because you have security and a greater degree of certainty over what your end values will be, how much money will come back into the scheme because it's affordable housing, they are fixed. There's a huge amount of risk in a 15-year programme. So the finance rate reflects that level of risk to Cllr as the developer over a 15-year programme. I think it's a different scheme, but if I could draw a comparison to a regeneration scheme by a central London borough within Zone 1 of July this year, regeneration scheme of about 800 homes, mix of private and affordable, approved by the borough, approved by the GLA. They adopted two finance rates. For the affordable housing, solely affordable housing, the finance rate, which passed through all the scrutiny, was 4.25%. For those phases being developed, effectively the private sales dimension was being developed in concert with private developers, they're adopting a 6.5% rate. So here we've adopted a blended rate across the whole, when actually the majority of the scheme is actually private sale homes to fund the regeneration. So in that context, 5% relative to another developer who might be at 6 or 7%, that's quite competitive. So the actual rate of finance itself at 5%, we are confident and comfortable it is robust in this context.
But presumably you knew all that before you wrote that. So why did you express skepticism there, which you're now saying is unwarranted?
In part, it was due to the fact that the finance rate, or the finance costs to the scheme, there are two dimensions. One is the rate of borrowing, which is assumed 5%. So we can talk about that. I have explained that dimension. The other is the model here is an interlinked financial model. So that financial model was required to be interlinked in the first instance so that High Path could cross-subsidise Eastfields and Ravensbury, which would be utterly unviable and would never have proceeded without it. The reverse of that, though, when you're in a situation where your scheme, which was generating the surplus, is all of a sudden carrying cost, as well as all of the additional costs which are set out in the Cabinet report about things like increased buybacks, huge costs of the programme, all of a sudden, your whole programme is carrying significant costs, incurring finance from a very early point in the programme. So there were 2 points. We wanted to interrogate the interest rate. And frankly, from my perspective, yes, it was an agreed assumption previously. I will always go and scrutinise anyway. I think it's always worth comparison. 5% is still, I've seen lower. They have tended to be for higher proportions of affordable housing with lower proportions of private. So I will always scrutinise it. I wasn't trying to preempt an outcome at all, but we think it's been robustly dealt with on both parts.
And what scrutiny did happen afterwards?
In terms of scrutiny from our perspective, clearly I work in a development team. We are engaged with viability reviews, as well as authoring viability appraisals from effectively both sides. So there was internal scrutiny within my team and my colleagues, effectively sense checking the levels of finance rates being appropriate. And we went back to Savills and we asked specifically the question, and they came back further with some justification from Clarion as to why kind of the costs, and it was specifically the bond issue, the point you rightly raised. We queried that and asked how that flowed through their development financing. So they also provided some explanation there.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few short follow-ups and hopefully short answers to keep you to time. I can imagine you're looking at that as well, like I would be in your seat. If it's all right, I want to call you James SQW from our Sustainable Communities meeting for differentiation. So firstly, you referred to previous schemes and making comparisons. For context, it would be helpful if you can outline how complex this particular analysis was in relation to others, and from a time perspective, what that would roughly entail given your 10 years plus of experience. And I've got some further follow-ups relating to project management, decent homes, and again, risk, which you touched on before.
In terms of complexity, frankly, this is right up there. I mean, I think as we're well aware of the order of magnitude here, which can't be understated, kind of 1.5 billion plus costs and values across 3 estates, each with their own dynamics, their own resident populations, different development programs, different phasing. They've all different communities, and I think that goes to the heart of this. This is not simply one block of residents who are a single community. It's an incredibly complex position on the ground. So it is enormously complex. There are all of the other moving parts. I think a significant proportion of our time over the last 12 months supporting this process has been around not just examining viability, but it's kind of, say, kicking the tires on the entire development. It's planning, it's CPO programs, deliverability risk, it's leaseholder buybacks. There are so many different dimensions that the danger is, we are here as financial viability experts, but it's development viability, and viability is a function of the development itself. So we have been providing that advice and supporting that particular process. It has been incredibly complex. And I think, if I may, there was a point that Cllr Gretton raised around the timing of the inputs, which we reviewed, which were provided to us back in March. Provided to us in April 2020, collated in March 2020. It takes time to review and properly scrutinise material of an order of magnitude and complexity that this scheme is. So there was a thorough process we went through between April and June to do that. I think I'd just as well worth adding that the material provided, the inputs and assumptions, were as of March pre-COVID. And actually, at that point in time in June, we considered it prudent not to start diving into revised sales values, not to dive into revised sales costs, because we were all stuck in our living rooms at that particular point in time. And it was a very different world we were living in. But actually, the figures were provided, possibly more by luck than judgment. Lockdown happened in mid-March, but these were pre-lockdown. So actually, the effects of COVID had not washed through at that particular point in time. As ever, there are so many different variables and as James pointed out, there was no silver bullet to resolving this issue. Our advice at the time was, we've scrutinised this heavily. There were some improvements that were made, but limited in the overall scale of things. 20 million sounds like a lot, but not when the deficit's over 200. So we set out a series of what we thought pragmatic recommendations of all of the variables which could be tested. But in testing variables, you almost need to pick off one at a time, not keep on testing all variables all at the same time, because it is simply not a productive use of time. And it's a much more efficient process to step through it, which we hope the Cabinet report has articulated a sequential approach. Of course, we're fully cognizant, and as we've identified, we recommended a further viability review before entering into contract. There's been some additional work presented to you tonight which Clarion undertook some very high-level analysis of their advisor Savills. We have reviewed. This is a high-level market overview rather than a full viability appraisal. But actually, if we look at house prices or sales values in Merton, as we identified in the Cabinet report, very differential picture. Large family homes, absolutely, sales values have gone up. Flatted developments, particularly new builds, different story. Yes, there have been price sales values increases, quite limited. And I think Councillor McCabe flagged earlier inflation. I think we cannot lose sight of cost inflation. Cost is a real pressure on all development, all construction, at all scales, whether it's roof extension or a regeneration project across the country. So there is this interplay between sales growth, yes, but also cost pressures, which will need to be managed and absolutely will subject it to their further round of scrutiny before you enter into contract again. Hopefully that gives some context to the complexity and the timing.
Yeah, no, I'm fully confident on the robustness of the work you've done and the time spent on it. And I understand that being an amateur modeler myself, but thank you very much for outlining that process. So going to James, actually. So I want to touch now on 2014, the decision on decent homes. So a bit of background here for colleagues who don't know. As chair of the Sustainable Communities panel, the panel have been inviting Clarion in to our meetings to address the issue of estate repairs, and I'm very grateful for them to come in to the panel to answer and address the challenges and present the progress made. And I believe there are 2 or 3 more appearances before the end of the committee, the panel season, as it were, where we will continue to review that. But we know housing standards is a big issue. It's a big local concern as well. What I want to understand is what was the mindset of that 2014 decision, if you're aware of, if there's any historical corporate memory for that. And my understanding was that there was a time limit on that. Is there any, can you shed any light onto why it wasn't then, why that clause didn't automatically come into implementation?
Certainly, I'm not the day-to-day responsibility for that, but certainly the 2014 suspension was time limited. And during that period of time, that's when we worked with Clarion and also through them with the residents of the estates to provide an alternative delivery mechanism for that, for the decent homes. I think we progressed in good faith on that basis, that the decent homes delivery would pass from refurbishment through to new build, and therefore the spirit of that clause was being followed through. I think the one of the lessons we've learned is that it's been mentioned, the complexity of a regeneration program like this, safeguards to fall back to ensure that people's residents' properties are maintained appropriately beyond just I suppose the health and safety issues, because those are some of the considerations you've been looking at in scrutiny, that we would certainly look that residents have the protection that while they can look forward to new build, they would also have a default position of a refurbished property in the future if a timetable which we are finalising with Clarion is not adhered to, and still maintain the requirement for a replacement property to be built subsequently. So I think there was a combination of working through progressively on new build, replacing the refurbishment for the delivery of decent homes. That has taken longer than we had anticipated, and therefore we are ensuring that there are safeguards to protect that in the future.
Can I just follow up on that then? So from a project management perspective, 2 more potentially brief. Thank you. Okay. So one of in the papers we're presenting to tonight, there was a reference to the progress made in implementing the agreed works in terms of the stock transfer. So with that level of progress, what project management mechanisms or indeed transparency in terms of, say, reporting through scrutiny, reporting publicly, and other means do you propose there will be further regen from, again, we've not heard a date yet, so that if progress isn't accelerated, then means can be put in place to ensure it does?
So I think that this period being the, if you like, the kickstart of the restart of the project, we are proposing that there will be an annual paper to Scrutiny that would provide programme for the year ahead in some detail, and that is part of the review process of the business plan with Clarion. That would also then in subsequent years be a review of what's happened in the past year, and then look forward to what the forthcoming year is. So that will be reporting back on the performance against the build rate, any clauses that we've invoked in terms of penalty or alternative delivery for a period of time. Because I think it's a bit about, I think that the regeneration is complex, but we need to keep Clarion's nose to the wheel, but we've also got to be realistic that at times there are events that are beyond our control, and what is the mitigation for that, but ultimately pressing forward to get to the end goal. So annually, and I think that I'd stress that the amount of information that James SQW has referred to is quite considerable, and there's a lot of work that will go into that, and we believe that annually is the time to do that. But in this first year, it's forward-looking. In subsequent years, it's a review plus the year ahead.
Can I very briefly? There's in the public papers, there's a reference to a figure for the decent home standard cost. So it's 25 million. Is that an appropriate costing now? This is probably more James SQW question, given any inspections that has happened. So what my understanding is, what I'm trying to get at is the reputational damage and the challenge of this and the length of time that residents will continually need to wait for a new property. Is that figure represented now in that costings that we've been given, or does further work need to be done? And if it does need to be done, is there a balance just to implement the standard?
I would look to James to advise if that figure is in the right ballpark. I think in terms of the process, that's why it will be important to understand what the year ahead is seeking to deliver. So how many residents will move from the current property into a new build. And one of the clear things on that is what is a reasonable time to wait before they actually in their current homes, because there's reference to the decent homes, but there's also what's called the Merton standard. And when properties are not at that level, what is the period of time? I think that there's been significant progress. I think members have been made aware that there's considerable progress that's been made on those commitments. I think that what it does reflect is that decent homes does not deal with everything across the piece. So, for instance, the lifetime of kitchens and bathrooms is probably considerably longer than we would have anticipated, but it's in line with government guidance. So, during that period of time, some properties may fall into that circa 20-year scope, and we will be working with Clarion to ensure that if that is required, because they are not forecast to be rehoused anytime soon, that some of those decent homes works may well come into play.
Nick, and then I think we need to start making up our minds, actually.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, just very quickly on the decent homes figure, which is in the appraisal of 25.7 million or there or thereabouts. That figure, in effect, is treated as kind of an imputed value. It is a cost saving on the kind of revenue, it's on the income side of the appraisal. That figure was advised by Clarion back in 2018 and hasn't been updated since on that particular point. The effect of that, if the cost of those works were to increase, it would enhance the viability of the scheme. The order of magnitude would be still nowhere near touching the sides with closing that deficit, just to be quite clear. But I do agree it is probably a point which requires further updating. That information we did request wasn't available at the time.
Thank you, Chair. A question to James McGinlay. James, in your opening comments or previous comments, you referred to the surprise when Clarion approached you or the council. Indeed, Jed Curran also confirms that in his letter to the Chief Exec of Clarion in March 2020. Of course, Keith Exford, the then CEO of 2018, had also highlighted the risks of the transfer and the regeneration plans had been subject of detailed consideration by your board, this being Clarion's board. He also highlighted the risks of such a long-term undertaking, and he concluded that the board had agreed to proceed because its size, balance sheet, and expertise could shoulder the commitment. And indeed, in that letter dated March 2020, the then Chief Executive Merton went on to say this analysis of Clarion's strength is repeated in the documentation you currently provide to prospective investors. James, we've talked about the complexity of the development. You said that in 2018, when the planning application went through, you treated Clarion as any other developer. Well, they're not any other developer, are they? They are taking a major £1 billion, in excess of £1 billion development, and they were subject to a stock transfer agreement. The stock transfer, Merton's stock transfer. So my question is to you, why was not more robust documentation put in place when this process in 2014 was started to ensure that Clarion would deliver?
Thank you, Chair. There was the existing stock transfer agreement, which was the guiding document at the time of the original transfer, and that carried forward and is still the document that we work to. The application to do the estate regeneration was treated as any other developer, because we don't. The stock transfer agreement does not give us any scope to control what they would do by way of redevelopment and regeneration. What it did was give us specific contractual obligations, the clawback being an example, if the estate regeneration was to take place. The level of change from 2018 to 2020 was surprising. I think as you go through the information supplied by SQW, you'll see that there were a number of factors that came into play that were felt to be something that, while it produced a deficit, were clear and understandable. Whether those risks should have been seen earlier was a question that I think we're seeking to clarify, because, for example, the buybacks have been more successful. But many of those issues were based on industry standard approaches to what would be a reasonable assumption on those. So I think what we were presented with in 2020 was a position where we had a number of factors that came into play to reduce the deficit. One where we, as officers, sought to, as I say, validate and then see what the opportunities were to bring it back into a delivery mode. So I think that recognise that the stock transfer agreement had a number of controlling mechanisms in it, but they were largely to control the delivery of decent homes. We did not introduce any amendments to the stock transfer agreement with the estate regeneration, other than to protect the delivery of the decent homes. I think largely because that document was superseded by, had the parallel document of the planning approval, and at the time we felt that was a sufficiently strong document to govern the delivery, but it wasn't one that was linked to the clawback, the stock transfer agreement. It was independent of it.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly, so in you're basically confirming that amendments could have been introduced and therefore the agreement could have been strengthened to ensure that we weren't in this position today.
No, I wouldn't want to mislead. I don't think I said that the amendments could have been made. I said we didn't seek amendments, and that's I'm not aware because I haven't asked that question. What amendments could have been incorporated? They weren't at the time, and indeed in the subsequent discussions, I think that it's clear that what we had was an obligation for the delivery of decent homes, And as I mentioned earlier, that the council sought to deliver that either through refurbishment or in the estate regeneration through new build. And either of those were deemed to be delivery of decent homes rather than estate regeneration in its totality. So it wasn't sought, so I can't say whether it would have been deliverable.
Okay, on that note, then can I direct a question to Councillor Welton and ask him why it wasn't sought?
In terms of the 2014 decision, I mean, at the time, I wasn't obviously cabinet member at that time, but clearly, obviously, it's a very complex system. One of the things we did put in place was the 10 pledges. I think there would have been a risk that if you had contractually said that this had to be paid, they could have well walked away because, as you know, from the original agreement, they weren't obligated to undertake estate regeneration, and those papers have subsequently been provided for.
Councillor Butler, and then we're going to move to decide whether we're going to refer this back or not.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm hoping my final question will lead into that decision-making process there. My current feeling is we haven't really got from the proposers of this call-in what would be proportional to justify these people continuing to live in these overcrowded homes. So if we were to decide to refer back the decision to Cabinet, and in my opinion, belonging these people living in overcrowded homes, can I get an answer just procedurally from the council? What would then happen? How long would it take if it were to then, the Cabinet would reconsider it and then perhaps make the same decision again, how long that would take, but also to ask Clarion if it's appropriate or any others sat here that could contribute to this, any consequences in the meantime of that pause in proceedings, because I think that's an important consideration regardless of my current leanings in this decision. Thank you.
Just in terms of processes outlined the recommendation, any recommendation that was approved by the Scrutiny Commission would be referred back to Cabinet. It would very much depend on the nature of what that recommendation was as to whether there was additional work prior to going back to Cabinet to do that. It would put a delay into the process that just by the passage of time there will be a delay. But I think it'll be for Clarion to see what the consequence of that delay would be on their programme. The scheduling of those reporting back to Cabinet would be based on the Cabinet schedule over the remainder of the fiscal year.
On that, yes. I think it would be helpful, yes, just briefly the implications of a delay.
Okay, thank you for that. I think answering your question is the longer the decision goes on, of course, the longer the people will live in these homes. Yeah, and we'll continue to look after them. But we all know the challenges that we've got. We know the overcrowding challenges we've got. This programme that we've brought forward is ultimately to deliver quality, affordable homes in a quality environment. One of the questions we were asked for, what's our commitment with the planning situation? Planning is democratic. We've done a lot of work around that. We've worked with the Merton team and we've also worked with our advisors and our team. And we've got to a position with our board that the board are committed to delivering the regeneration project on the recommendation of your cabinet meeting. And that's the commitment that we're giving and we want to move forward on. So the longer we prolong this, the more challenges we have for our residents. But we have a commitment to deliver on this moving forward, working with the London Borough of Merton.
Thank you, Chair. Both Councillor Welton and the representative from Clarion have mentioned their sort of commitments to Merton residents. Are they able to tell us how many of the commitments that were made in 2014 have since been broken?
I mean, a lot of the commitments made in 2014 were obviously relating to the guarantees in terms of the consultation process and the process in terms of delivering regeneration. Most of them have actually been met, especially obviously in relation to the buybacks and consultation. Clearly, there are challenges, as we know, in terms of the repair service.
I think most of them may have been met. I think four of them definitely haven't been. And on that basis, what reason is there for the residents living in these homes to expect that that they can trust the council to continue to uphold standards in the future?
In terms of the council upholding, I think I've been very strong in terms of the repair service was unsatisfactory and that Clarion failed a lot of people living on those estates. And I find that incredibly disappointing, and I have been very robust with them as the cabinet member. I think it's building that faith and building that trust, because if they don't get the repairs sorted out, then ultimately residents won't have confidence in them to deliver regeneration. But Clarion have got a warning from what happens. They know they need to get their act together, but ultimately those houses need to be rebuilt because a lot of those houses are not satisfactory accommodation, especially in terms of the level of overcrowding. Regularly when I go on those estates, there's people in one-bedroomed homes with 3 kids. That can't be satisfactory in any way, shape or form. And that's what's very important in terms of obviously the uplift in habitable rooms, but also as well in terms of the number of bedrooms. Overcrowding is a major issue for many of our tenants living in social housing in this borough. And this regeneration will help address these, along with giving high quality homes. If we've been to High Path, I've been very impressed with the standard of development, likewise on Ravensbury, and I would obviously urge any councillor who hasn't been to them yet to visit to see what can happen. And that's only the first stage of regeneration. So regeneration has been ongoing. Obviously we would like things to go a lot faster, and hopefully tonight we will agree that. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Just a quick one.
Very last one.
Councillor Welton, can you tell us what you will do if they don't get their act together?
I think, if they don't get their act together, well, clearly they will have challenges in terms of the regeneration. Obviously, in terms of where we are as a council, we have held them to account through regular meetings. But I think Clarion are well aware that they have got major challenges that they've had to address. There is evidence that they are addressing it. But I know that if people lose faith in any ability of Clarion to deliver the regeneration, then ultimately it won't be successful. People need to obviously buy in to it, but they also as well need to improve the repair service.
So you won't do anything?
I think that's completely untrue, that I won't do anything at all. I have been very robust in terms of it, given the controls that I have available to me as cabinet member. I don't have statutory powers. That's the social housing regulator. I probably would like to have more powers, but that's the legislation which we are operating under as a council. So quite clearly they do have to get these things right, and I will continue to be vocal on that.
Okay. I think also this is Clarion's largest regeneration project by far at the current time. So that there is a reputational onus upon them to get it right too. James Kinnersly did say it is right up there on the complexity scale. Notwithstanding that, we've got to make our minds up now as to whether we wish to refer this back to Cabinet for reconsideration? And if so, I'd like to hear on what grounds people might want to do that. Sally.
Thank you, Chair. The one thing I've always felt is people need decent living accommodation. We're not talking about palaces or anything, but having seen some of the state of disrepair and the state of those homes that do need regeneration, it is a gamble. Everything in life is a gamble. Whatever we do personally or for the residents of Merton, it is a gamble because nothing is set in stone that is going to be 100% success. But I think the testimonies we've heard today from expert witnesses, people who know the subject inside out, which I think I have a flavour of it, but I can't say I'm absolutely on top of everything. But if we delay this, we are putting people's lives in an unacceptable position for a longer period of time. The most essential thing is to hold Clarion to account every inch of the way, but to make sure the regen goes ahead for the sake of those people who deserve decent homes of a decent standard to live a happy life. When I did sit as sub on one of the sustainable communities, I said I would not want to live there. I would hate it. It would, I think, cause me enormous stress, although I'm an incredibly strong person. I don't know how I would cope with those circumstances. And I think for any one of us to try to put our residents in that unpleasant circumstance and position for any longer than is necessary is questionable. And I find it very difficult to understand why some people want a delay, perhaps to prove a point. Yes, density is an issue, but everything is going through planning and everything is scrutinised, and we've heard from now. And I think we have to go ahead for the sake of our residents. And they desperately, desperately need these new build properties.
Thank you, Sally. That's very clear, actually. Ben, you wanted to go on.
A bit too clear, actually. I stole some of my thunder there. So, yeah. Yeah, having been to High Path for as many weekends as I care to remember, COVID aside, safety aside, meeting these people in the situations that Sally has just described, and to read these proposals and to have no clear, to these questions here that, and have no clear sight for these people who, some of them have been promised regeneration for decades. And for us to sit here and say this could potentially be delayed indefinitely, or for the 6 weeks on the cabinet schedule or whatever, is too long. Frankly, where is the proportionality of making these people live in that situation for any day longer than they need to? And that's why I'm rejecting this call in. I think we should go ahead with the decision that Cabinet made. Thank you.
Chair, as a young child, I lived in very poor housing. I shared a bedroom with my parents. We didn't have a bathroom. And there was a point in my life as a young child where we were provided with a new council home. It was built, it was funded by a Conservative government that knew just how bad it was for families to live in poor housing. And they still had people within that party at that time who felt we had to change the life chances of such families. And the day I moved into that new flat, it was as though we had won the lottery. It was a joyous occasion. I know from my personal experience what a difference that made to my life chances. I had somewhere to do my homework. I had somewhere to pursue an opportunity that was provided for me and eventually to go on to higher education and achieve the things that I have in life. And I honestly don't believe that would have happened without that opportunity. Now, for me, Chairman, this is about providing opportunities for youngsters in Merton today to have those same opportunities. And anyone that wants to delay that has to look those families and those children in the eye and explain themselves. And what we've heard this evening is that if Clarion walk away, we won't get any clawback because there won't be a regeneration. And so for me, this is an opportunity to provide new, decent houses for the families that we are here to represent, that we are here to support. And I am not going to delay this process. I will not support a reference back to Cabinet for the reasons that I've explained.
Steve, can we hear from you now?
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. A bit like earlier, I feel my thunder's been stolen, but I did want to say a few things. Having done this job for many, many years, I think the thing that needs to be considered in all of this, notwithstanding all my learned colleagues' views on balance sheets, is people's needs, hopes and aspirations. I've dealt with thousands of people. People are very resilient, but they're resilient if there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's unfair to think that the answer to our customers is always no. There's just over 9,000 people queuing up now. And last year we saw 16 3-bedroom homes available for families in housing need. Without the regeneration, then those numbers will not be increased. So whilst I'm impartial to the debate, I wanted to add a perspective that happens on a daily basis within the housing needs service. And we touched on very briefly the additionality. And whilst I'm not going to comment on that, we also have to think about new households forming, those families that will face homelessness and the new statutory duties that the council has. So, you know, that's a whistle stop thinking from me, but thank you for listening. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much, Steve. It's a helpful perspective. I'm going to come to Paul next. And then.
Thank you. Merton knew about this over 18 months ago. The SQW report was written over a year ago, 15 months ago. To argue that a delay of a few weeks to send it back to Cabinet is putting people doing our tenants and our residents down. It's not the point. You've sat on this for ages. There's been a total failure here. Clarion has run rings around Merton. Scrutiny, in answer to your question, Councillor McLean, a Conservative amendment which was unanimously passed. Scrutiny was meant to deal with this. You said there would be scrutiny panel, the Sustainable Communities Scrutiny Panel would look at this regularly. It hardly ever did. When it did, it wasn't told about these problems. I'm afraid, James, as with Morantum, you saw this problem. You didn't think about pre-decision scrutiny. You didn't go through that process at all. You ignored scrutiny. At every point, this council has not been transparent. It's been utterly untransparent about it. It's hidden it. It's now rushing it through. It's now using the tenants and leaseholders as if quite cynically, when they've sat on this for 18 months, it's simply not good enough. And on my last point, on scrutiny, why does scrutiny not take place? Because Clarion said, and I quote Let me hear. John Freeman at a scrutiny panel. He's not keen to participate in Merton's scrutiny process. It doesn't matter because Clarion's scrutiny process will deal with these problems. Well, it clearly didn't. Clearly didn't. There's been a total failure of scrutiny, and it's shocking that we are not going to send this through if we don't send this through. Thank you. Send this back. Thank you.
Let me come to, I will continue, but Councillor Dehaney next. John.
Yes, yes, thank you. I think that there should be no delay in this, in Cllr carrying on this development. I agree with everyone who has said that we shouldn't prevent Cllr from going ahead at speed. I recently had to deal with a constituent who lived in a one-bedroom flat above a shop. They have 3 children, and one was an 18-year-old girl. There was nowhere for them to go. The council had no property to rehouse them. So therefore, we can't delay any development at this stage. It has to go ahead.
Nick.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to endorse what Councillor Cllr has just said. I do think it should be referred back to Cabinet. We've heard about the complexity. I do think it's also very rich to hear from some members on here of the Labour Party when we've seen how the residents have had to live in Eastfields and in other estates. It's quite disgraceful. So therefore, I would like to move that this decision is sent back to Cabinet and to be reviewed again. Thank you.
So if you're putting that forward, do you want to set out any particular circumstances to why it should be referred back, or just that wording there?
Well, on the proportionality, but also on the fact of the complexity, the fact that it came to scrutiny just on the on the Thursday before it was then going to Cabinet. As Councillor Cllr said, it's been sat on for a long, long period of time. We've heard about the complexities. We believe, or I believe, and like to move, this is re-looked at by the Cabinet.
Second man.
Anything happy? Wording there, yes, got that. So we do have a proposal that this be referred back to Cabinet for reconsideration. Can I see all those in favour, please? And against? 6, so that's 3, 6. I will not be voting. Clear on numbers? Yep. In that case, so I can just thank everyone for their, at least one thing you can say about scrutiny is it does allow us to, or give us the opportunity to dig much further into things than hitherto. We have got a report now published, which was previously exempt. That's some achievement. And I'm also very grateful to our officers and indeed to colleagues from Clarion for the, and to James particularly for the time they've devoted to answering our questions this evening. Thank you all very much. So thereby close the meeting.